Thanks very much, Rebecca. I think probably what I wanted to do today actually was specifically to talk around the importance of campaigning around stigma, and how do you build campaigns that tackle this, and why we need to think of this through a campaigning lens. I suppose, firstly, that's part of how I ended up in Clifford Chance. I've been the role for about 2 years here, but had come from the world of campaigning, which was, and many of those campaigns were, very directly connected to stigma. I was the director of the Australian campaign for marriage equality, the public vote, in 2018. On the yes side, I should probably say, as I would be a remarkably strange hire if I had been the leader of the no side, which we won, thankfully, and had been the political director of the Irish campaign for marriage equality up to 2015, which again was successful and became the first country in the world to pass marriage equality by a public vote. And before that, I had been the policy officer for GLEM, which was the national LGBT organisation in Ireland, and we'd done a lot of work as well around HIV, and all of these campaigns, in a way, especially the HIV one, really focused on the challenge of stigma and how tricky it is to dismantle. And I thought maybe that's what would be useful today to think about for the perspective of everyone watching today, is to think through, well, what are the principles that underpin a good anti-stigma campaign, for the want of a better phrase for it, and how challenging it can be. And I think the first place to start actually on this is, that this is a permanent campaign. And I think we need to think of it that way. When we're trying to take on stigma, we're taking on something that's very enduring. And you're trying to run a campaign to unravel hundreds, if not thousands of years of attitude. And that's a challenge. And that's the scale of the challenge too. And that's in a way, we need to remind ourselves of that. So this isn't, as simple as pushing a door or announcing a policy or rolling out, a single initiative or having a nice one-day event. What we're trying to do is tackle embedded cultural attitudes that were built long before any of us or any of our great-great-great-great-grandparents were around. So that's not going to be done in a simple day and a simple moment. I think, the other bit about that is, as well as trying to take a look at our own workplaces to unravel this stigma and the level of challenge in that is, so you're trying to unravel thousands of years or hundreds of years of embedded thinking, but also that embedded thinking still exists, and it exists both in our workplaces and outside our buildings. So even if we get the campaign correct in our workplaces, we have to remember that everybody returns to the real world afterwards, and they're going back to a world where all this social stigma is all too often totally embedded. So I think, for the purpose of today, one of the first principles of successful campaigning, if you're trying to do this in a workplace, is the permanence of this. Understanding the scale of trying to unravel an attitude that has existed for centuries, but that continues to exist outside your doors. And that means there has to be a commitment to permanent campaigning. The idea that you are constantly working on this, that your communication on this has to be both continuous and constant and clear. Because otherwise, as soon as you stop pushing this, the real world, takes back over in terms of creating the tone and the narrative around this. And I think that, getting your management within firms and the leadership within firms to understand that that's the level of continuous campaigning that's required, or else this becomes an incredible amount of expended energy that doesn't change anything, because it becomes, Sisyphusian almost. You end up having the world's greatest initiative that lasts a month, and then everybody goes back to work, and the tide takes it out, and all the good benefit of it disappears. So being ready and prepared to commit to this being a permanent campaign, and one that you're planning and designing on that basis, that this is constant waves of communication. because otherwise the progress won't sustain itself. And I think, in a way, for stigma, this is even more challenging than campaigns to create rule changes or law changes, because, you know, when we think sometimes about progress, we can sometimes be quite lax about it, and we can think that it's inevitable, when in fact there's no evidence to suggest that it's inevitable. In fact, there's all the evidence in the world to suggest progress is the least inevitable thing in the world. It only happens when there's a commitment and constant leaning in, constant pushing, constant campaigning. But of course, the other thing about great social change is it can be the victim of itself, in that it becomes so successful that very quickly people think it was always easy to achieve it. So you run a brilliant campaign, and then everything feels awesome for a couple of months, and you think, this is just so awesome, it's going to sustain itself, and it won't. So first principle, I would say, is the idea of constant and continuous campaigning, and knowing that from the very start you have to devise a plan that shows that. I think the other piece that became very important for us when it came to campaigns around marginalized communities and marginalized people and people facing significant stigma was the ability to create space for conversation. And we knew that this was a real problem in trying to drive real change, because we knew that there was a lot of people would like to care and did care, and wanted to ask people questions around how they were feeling. Or in the case of other minority campaigns, for example, when we were doing marriage campaigns, stigmatized communities, asking them what they felt about the issue. But the fear of getting language wrong and the fear of not being able to engage in a way that would be seen as respectful just stopped people engaging. And that was a nightmare for us in campaigning, because what we need people to do is create great conversation and create that space. And we have to allow people to know that it's good to talk. So creating an environment within your permanent and constant campaign that is always messaging and thinking about, how do you create tone that creates space? How do you create tone that allows people to confidently know that their discussions are valuable? And in fact, its discussions on the ground are probably one of the greatest drivers of real cultural change. And if people are scared to have those discussions, then all of that can't happen. And in a way, I mean, I think about how much people wanted to ask in the run-up to campaigns around HIV and stigma and LGBT dimensions on stigma as well. You know, people just go, well, I'd love to ask Auntie Mary a question about this, but I don't know the acronyms. I don't know the right terminology. If I get it wrong, will Auntie Mary throw me out of the house or think I'm being disrespectful? And in a way, the world of inclusion creates these barriers ourselves, because we're learning all the time, which is brilliant. But part of that learning is we're also creating new lexicons and new libraries of words and all these new concepts, which are incredibly important. But we have to make sure they're not barriers to people having conversation. We have to allow people to know that you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. And what we really want to challenge stigma is individual advocacy. So taking away the barriers, allowing people to know that, you know, you're going to get language wrong sometimes, you're going to stumble on the words, you know, and I think that matters greatly. It also turns out, of course, when people start to talk, because they really enjoy it, because it turns out we do like each other's company. And it turns out many of us really want to ask these questions, and because we want to support. So it becomes this great unlocking if you build a campaign that understands that barrier to conversation is real and that it won't take itself down. You have to work out how that stigma campaign takes it down. And in a way, this is about having faith in people. And I think, you know, underneath it all, I think this is so important for us, because I think people have phenomenal capacity to be awesome advocates. And in fact, when it comes to changing culture, you know, each of us are the most powerful ambassadors in our own space of our own values. our job, if we're trying to campaign to unlock and challenge stigma, or to challenge stigma rather, is to unlock that space and unlock that our individuals' confidence, so that they can see that they are great agents of change when they make space for communication. So making space for communication is so critical in this. And again, I don't want to say make this challenging. That's hard in the current world. In the current world, the tone of conversation, if we turn on our mobile phones in the morning, isn't that pleasant communication conversation space. And this is a really important piece for challenging stigma at the moment, as in general, because even when we look at the media, not just social media, what constitutes public debate all too often is just public argument, and lots of sound and fury and no light for people. So actually empowering individuals to create that space is even more important, because the venues where that used to be created aren't as useful at it anymore. And we have a whole range of new technological venues, like in social media platforms, which all too often are creating the wrong environment and the wrong tone. So making space for conversation. Second one, that's it. I think the third and fourth point. The third one on this one is inclusion and tackling stigma is about understanding that the issue is a who and not a what. And how do you make space for people to take the journey from what to who? Stigma all too often is not even all too often, is easier when it's against a thought, when it's against a concept or an idea. So in the same way that marginalization is easier when a topic is when a group of people are dehumanized, when it becomes a topic or a theory rather than real people. So making sure your campaign allows people to take the journey to who is so important. And part of that, again, is, it turns out, and maybe I'm an optimist about the world, it turns out I think people are pretty awesome when you create the right environment for them. And I think when it comes to stigmatizing people tend to not want to do it. It's not in our human nature to want to. It is much easier to do it when it just becomes a theory. So using your campaign to present the power of human stories, and you putting those human stories, that visibility of humanity in the center of your campaign, isn't just a nice thing to do. It's actually utterly central, because it is only when people start to take that journey and understand that inclusion is a who that they can become transformed in their opinion on stigma, and becomes real advocates in wanting to actively dismantle that stigma. So whether that's campaigns like we have done here, around constantly profiling human experiences, sometimes people talking directly about their own mental health and well-being, but sometimes it's people talking about the challenges of mental health and well-being for somebody else. All the time thinking, when you're running a great communications plan that's trying to bring out the humanity of an issue, that there will be many different voices and faces that will connect for different people. And sometimes that will be someone talking about how their parent dealt with well-being. Sometimes it's about how their spouse dealt with it, or sometimes it's their own journey. But knowing that a great campaign is a collection of all of those. So I think that third point is, for us, is inclusion is a who, not a what. And therefore human stories are transformational in challenging stigma. And my final point, and then I'm going to hand over to Nancy. My final point quickly on this one is, you have to actively demonstrate your commitment to challenging inclusion. I think this is a big challenge sometimes in a lot of workplaces. In a lot of workplaces, because they don't all have cultures where we do put up our hand and ask a question in case we get the question wrong. It becomes all the more important that our campaigns empower people to go, actually, you can have the best values in the world. You can hate stigma. You can think stigma against people who have people experiencing different level of experience around well-being. You can hate the idea that there's a real stigma out there, but if you're not telling anyone, or if you're not challenging it, then it's a secret. And the real danger of values is when they're kept in our head and not actively demonstrated. Because for two things, one, the obvious one, you're not driving change. But the other part of that is the impact that has on people who are stigmatized. So if you are someone who experiences stigma or fears stigma from mental health and well-being, and you live in the real world, and you come to work every day to your workplace, then your experience of the real world has taught you that there is stigma against mental health and well-being. That's just the reality. So that's the experience you will expect everywhere until someone actively demonstrates otherwise. So for people in our firms, our campaigns have to allow them to understand and appreciate that silently having your values in your head isn't just not part of the solution of challenging stigma, it's part of the problem of not being able to challenge stigma. Because people who've already experienced it will just presume that you aren't necessarily the person who is going to challenge stigma. Why would they make the presumption that you are? So understanding that your campaign has to draw out active inclusion in people, I think, is so important. How do you empower people to see that when they're actively demonstrating their commitment, not alone are they changing culture, but they're sending radically powerful messages to individuals who have faced stigma. And they won't even know they're sending them, but they'll change the workplace for those people because they'll know this is a place that sees them. This is a place that knows that they exist. So my shortened campaign version of this one for today, is that one. This is a permanent campaign. It is a campaign that has to be based on human stories and human reality. It has to be one that understands that you have to draw out active inclusion from people so that they can demonstrate their values. And, the great thing is these campaigns can and should be rewarding, but they are challenging because, and we shouldn't underestimate the scale of this. If we want to tackle this, campaigning is hard, and it's going to take a commitment to not switching off and to be continuously committed to it. So hopefully that's a good, useful starting point today. And I think I'm going to bounce back over to you, Nancy, or Rebecca, which
Thank you, Tiernan.